If you're trying to get into cybersecurity, you probably ask yourself what certifications should you get first, right? Maybe whether you need a degree, whether you should build a home lab, how you're supposed to get experience when no one will hire you without experience. Those can be, very reasonable questions, but they usually come too early. Here's what I mean by that. When you start, asking what cert to get or what lab to build, you're preparing for an industry instead of preparing for an actual job. And cybersecurity isn't one job. A SOC analyst and a GRC analyst and a penetration tester, a cloud security professional, they all require very different combinations of knowledge, skills, and experience. What most people actually need is an ordered process for making career decisions instead of collecting random credentials and following conflicting advice. So let me start you off by explaining um, the problem this creates. When you prepare for cybersecurity as a whole instead of for a specific role, a few things happen. First, you build the wrong foundation. Someone preparing for a SOC analyst role shouldn't necessarily follow the same path as someone interested in GRC or penetration testing, cloud security, for example. But without specific destination in mind, you can't really tell which preparation moves you closer to your goal and which preparation wastes time. Second, you pursue irrelevant certifications. You stack credentials because they appear on generic lists or because they sound impressive, not because they help you build or validate knowledge relevant to the role you're actually wanting to get. And third, you create proof that doesn't align with the roles you pursue. You build elaborate home labs that demonstrate technical ability in areas that don't matter for your target position. Or you build things that you just can't really explain. And fourth, you struggle to identify realistic entry points. You end up applying, to hundreds of positions because you can't determine which opportunities actually move you closer to your destination. So the solution isn't to avoid certifications or labs or preparation. The solution is to make those decisions in the right order. So the framework I use with students and others is a 5-step process. Discover, foundation, skills, proof, and entry. Each step influences the next. The order does matter. Together they create an ordered process for making career decisions. Let me walk you through each step. So step 1 is discover. The first step is to research specific cybersecurity roles rather than simply deciding to work in cybersecurity. This doesn't mean you have to choose a career forever. It means you need enough direction to stop preparing randomly. Start by identifying 3 to 5 specific cybersecurity roles that interest you. Then research beyond the titles and certification requirements to understand what someone in that role actually does. What are the day-to-day responsibilities? What technology do people in that role commonly use? What technical depth does the work require? What skills the employers request? What entry points do people typically use to reach that role? And you can answer these questions through job postings, informational interviews, online communities like Reddit's cybersecurity and IT forums, LinkedIn profiles of other people in the roles, and other career research and professional organizational websites. The goal is to build a realistic picture of each role before choosing a direction. And once you understand what someone in that position actually does, you can make better decisions about what to learn. Without this step, you build the wrong foundation, right? You pursue irrelevant certifications and create proof that doesn't really align with the roles you eventually pursue. So step 2 is foundation. Entry-level cybersecurity doesn't mean entry-level technology. You don't necessarily need 10 years of IT experience before moving into cybersecurity, but you do need to understand the technology you're trying to secure. The required depth varies, by role. A SOC analyst needs to understand networking concepts, operating systems, common protocols, log analysis, and how attackers move through systems. A GRC analyst may need less technical depth in network packet analysis, but still needs to understand how controls work, what risks different technologies introduce, and how systems interact. A cloud security professional needs to understand cloud architecture, identity and access management, infrastructure as code, the shared responsibility model, just to name a few things. The destination you identified during Discover determines what underlying technology and IT knowledge you need to build. Map the foundation requirements by identifying what knowledge your target role depends on. Do you need to strengthen your understanding of networking, operating systems, identity and access management, cloud fundamentals, Active Directory, basic scripting even, security fundamentals. Be honest about the gaps in your current knowledge. Prioritize, filling those gaps before moving to more advanced topics. This step should not, be interpreted as a universal requirement to work in help desk for 5 years, but understanding the technology you're trying to secure still matters. Step 3 is skills. Knowing cybersecurity and being able to do cybersecurity are two completely different things. At some point, learning has to become practice. What skills development looks like, depends on the target role you identified during Discover and the foundation you built in the previous step. A SOC analyst needs to practice, investigating alerts, analyzing logs, using SIM tools, identifying indicators of compromise, and documenting findings, right? But a GRC analyst needs to practice evaluating controls, mapping requirements to frameworks, conducting risk assessments, documenting compliance evidence, and identity and access management analysts, needs to practice configuring access controls, reviewing permissions, managing groups and roles, troubleshooting authentication issues, right? This is where certification decisions should connect back to your destination. Don't stack certifications just simply because they're popular or appear on generic lists. Ask whether a certification helps build or validate knowledge and skills relevant to the target role. Security Plus can be valuable because it covers, foundational security concepts that apply to many roles. But whether you should pursue, CISSP, CEH, OSCP, or other certifications really depends entirely on, where you're trying to go and what you need to learn or demonstrate. The same principle applies to home labs. Build what you need to learn, not what sounds impressive. If you're targeting a SOC analyst role, build a lab that lets you practice investigating alerts, analyzing logs, working with different security tools. If you're targeting a cloud security role, build environments in AWS or Azure, where you can practice implementing security controls, managing identities, securing infrastructure. Right? The goal is not the lab itself, but what you can do, and learn to do, because you can build it and then use it. Step 4 is proof. This step directly confronts the common problem of needing experience to get hired, but needing to get hired to gain experience. Employment is one way to gain experience, but it's not the only way to develop or demonstrate ability. Proof can come from projects, home labs, existing IT responsibilities, internships, volunteer work, competitions, documentation, or even relevant responsibilities from, current non-security positions. The important part is not simply claiming to have built something. It's being able to explain what you were trying to learn, what went wrong, how you troubleshot it, and what you do and would you do differently next time, right? That creates evidence of reasoning, troubleshooting, and curiosity, and practical ability. So I've seen this when, comparing candidates for the same security position. One candidate had an impressive looking home lab with a SIM, multiple virtual machines, and several security tools. But when I started asking, why they configured certain things or what happened when something broke, they struggled to explain it. They could tell me what they built, but not what they learned. Another candidate had a much simpler project. They set up, a basic environment to practice investigating authentication issues. But they had documented every decision made and mistake and troubleshooting step. They could walk me through what they were trying to learn. Why they configured something, a certain way, what didn't work the first time, and how they figured out, what was wrong and what they do differently next time. If I'm evaluating those two candidates, the second one gives me much more evidence of how they're going to perform on the job. A simple project you deeply understand may provide better evidence than a complicated project you just can't explain at all. So document what you build, investigate, or solve in a way that demonstrates your reasoning and troubleshooting ability. Write about what you were trying to learn, explain what you built and why you configured it that specific way. Right? Describe what went wrong and how you troubleshot it. Describe what you learned and what you would do differently next time. This preparation gives you something concrete to discuss during interviews and helps employers see what you can actually do. Step 5 is entry. A realistic entry point into cybersecurity may be a job that doesn't have security anywhere in the title. Depending on your current background, and target destination, useful entry points could include IT support, help desk, systems administration, network administration, cloud operations, identity and access management, compliance audit, risk, and other technology roles that build relevant experience. These should not automatically be viewed as failures or detours. If a position gives you meaningful exposure to technology, you'll eventually need to secure it. It may be a valuable step toward your destination. This question should not only be whether something is a cybersecurity job, but also whether it moves you closer to the cybersecurity role you eventually want. Someone targeting a SOC analyst role might benefit from experience in IT support or help desk, where they gain exposure to troubleshooting, working with tickets, analyzing logs, understanding how systems actually behave. Someone targeting a cloud security role they benefit from experience in cloud operations, where they gain hands-on experience with AWS or Azure infrastructure, identity and access management, and other cloud infrastructure. Right? Look for roles where your existing background, developing skills, and evidence create a reasonable match. Don't limit your search only to positions with cybersecurity or security in the title. Ask whether each opportunity moves you closer to your target cybersecurity role by providing relevant exposure to technology, processes, controls, or responsibilities you'll eventually need to secure. So the framework is a connected process where each step influences the next. It's not five-step independent tips, right? Discover determines the destination, foundation determines what you need to understand, skills determine what you need to be able to do, prove demonstrates the ability, and that ability mainly, and entry turns that preparation into a realistic career move. The order matters. If you skip discover, you may build the wrong foundation. If the foundation is weak, the practical skills become harder to develop. If you develop skills but never create proof, employers may have difficulty seeing what you can actually do. If you complete all the work but approach entry by applying, to hundreds of unrelated positions, much of the advantage created by the earlier steps is just lost. After understanding this framework, you should stop asking, how to get into cybersecurity, and instead work through a more useful sequence of questions. What role am I trying to reach? What does someone in that role actually do? What foundation does that work require? What do I need to do, and what do I need to be able to do? And how can I practice and improve those abilities? What jobs or opportunities can move me closer to that destination? That gives you a repeatable process, rather than another list of certifications or generic career tips. So here's where I would start, if I were you. Begin with discover. Research 3 to 5 specific cybersecurity roles that interest you before making decisions about certifications, degrees, or home labs. Look beyond job titles and certification requirements to understand day-to-day responsibilities, technologies, commonly used, and what someone actually spends their day doing. Then work through the remaining steps in order. Allow each step to inform the next. Map the foundation requirements based on your chosen destination. Develop skills intentionally rather than collecting random credentials. Create proof that demonstrates reasoning and troubleshooting ability. Approach entry by looking for roles where your preparation creates a reasonable match. If you found this framework helpful, I regularly share additional guidance on researching cybersecurity roles, building intentional certification strategies, even creating effective proof through projects and documentation, and identifying realistic entry points into the field. So go ahead and subscribe and stay updated on future content that breaks down each step in greater depth. Talk to you later.